Lyra stood on the edge of the bustling alien city, her pale blue skin and white hair catching the dim light of the twin moons above. Her heart felt heavy, each beat like a reminder of the family she no longer had. They had cast her out, calling her weak and unworthy. It wasn't her fault that she couldn't live up to their impossible expectations. She tried to fit into their rigid ways, but no matter how hard she worked, it was never enough. The voices and laughter of strangers filled the air around her, but none of it reached her. She was alone, more alone than she had ever been. As the crowd pushed and moved, Lyra pulled her cloak tighter around herself, hoping to disappear. The city lights glowed brightly, but they didn't comfort her. Instead, they only reminded her of how far she was from finding a place where she belonged. For hours, she wandered the streets, unsure of where to go. Her stomach growled, but she ignored it. She had no money, no friends, and nowhere to sleep. The thought of returning to her family crossed her mind, but she quickly pushed it away. Going back would mean admitting defeat, and she couldn't bear the idea of facing their cold, judging eyes again. As the night deepened, Lyra's legs grew weak. She found herself near the edge of the city, close to an old trading outpost. Ships of all shapes and sizes were parked there, some ready to leave, others in need of repair. She sat down on a bench nearby, her gaze drawn to a small workshop at the far corner. The warm yellow light spilling from its windows felt oddly inviting, and the sound of metal clinking against metal broke through her dark thoughts. Curious, Lyra stood and cautiously approached the workshop. Peering inside, she saw a human, something rare in these parts. He was tall, with messy brown hair and a focused expression. He wore a tool belt around his waist and worked on a piece of machinery that looked beyond saving. His hands moved quickly, as if each motion was part of a practice dance. Lyra's eyes widened. She had heard stories about humans, but had never met one. They were said to be clever and resourceful, though some called them reckless. Watching him now, she could see the truth in those words. Despite the chaos of his workspace, there was a quiet determination in the way he worked, as if failure wasn't an option. Her stomach growled again, louder this time, and the sound startled her. The human looked up, his green eyes locking onto hers. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Lyra stepped back, afraid she had intruded. "Hey, you okay?" the human asked, his voice kind but cautious. Lyra hesitated, unsure how to respond. She wasn't used to kindness. Most people ignored her or judged her before she even spoke. She nodded but stayed silent. "You don't look okay," he said, setting his tools down and wiping his hands on a rag. "Do you need help?" Lyra's throat tightened. She didn't know how to ask for help, not after being pushed away so many times. Finally, she whispered, "I don't know where to go." The human's expression softened. "Well, you're here now," he said. "Come inside. It's warmer in here." Lyra hesitated again, but stepped into the workshop. The air smelled of oil and metal, and the hum of machines filled the space. It was nothing like the grand cold halls of her family's home. It felt real, lived in, and strangely comforting. "My name's Ethan," the human said, offering the small smile. "What's yours?" "Lyra," she said softly. "Well, Lyra," Ethan said, pulling a chair over for her, "you look like you could use a rest. Sit down. We'll figure something out." Lyra sat on the old chair Ethan had offered her, her hands nervously clutching the edges. The warmth of the workshop felt strange, almost unfamiliar. She glanced around at the cluttered space. Tools scattered everywhere, half-finished projects resting on shelves, and a small workbench covered in blueprints. It was messy, but it felt alive. Unlike the cold, perfect halls of her family's estate, this place seemed welcoming. Ethan moved to a small counter at the back of the workshop. "You hungry?" he asked without looking at her. Lyra hesitated before nodding. Her stomach betrayed her with another growl, and Ethan chuckled softly. "Thought so." He rummaged through a box and pulled out a small metal container. Opening it, he revealed a collection of ration bars. "It's not gourmet, but it'll keep you going," he said, handing one to her. Lyra took the bar cautiously. The packaging felt foreign in her hands, but she unwrapped it and took a small bite. It was dry and slightly sweet, nothing like the rich, extravagant meals her family used to serve. Yet it tasted better because it came without judgment. Ethan leaned against his workbench, watching her with curious eyes. "So, Lyra," he began, "what brings you here? You don't look like someone who belongs on the edge of the galaxy." She froze, unsure how much to share. The memories of her family's rejection were still fresh, and the fear of being turned away again held her back. I needed to leave," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. Ethan didn't press her. Instead, he nodded and changed the subject. "Well, you picked a good place to hide. Most people here don't ask questions, and if they do, they're usually too busy fixing their own problems to care about anyone else's." Lyra relaxed slightly. His easygoing nature made it easier to breathe. She studied him as he returned to his workbench, picking up a strange-looking device and fiddling with its wires. "What are you doing?" she asked, her curiosity outweighing her caution. "Fixing this mess," Ethan replied with a grin. "It's an old navigation module. Someone thought it would be a good idea to jam a bunch of incompatible parts together. Now it's my job to make it work again." Lyra tilted her head, intrigued. "Can I see?" Ethan raised an eyebrow, but handed her the module. "Be my guest. Just don't touch the red wire unless you want sparks." She examined the device, her slender fingers tracing its edges. Though she wasn't familiar with human technology, her mind quickly pieced together its purpose. "This connector is in the wrong place," she said, pointing to a small piece. "It won't send power to the main circuit." Ethan blinked in surprise. "You know about tech?" "A little," Lyra admitted. She hesitated, then added, "My family taught me some things." "Well, you're right," Ethan said, taking the module back. "Guess you've got a good eye." The small compliment warmed her, and for the first time, she smiled. It wasn't much, but it felt like a step forward. Ethan noticed the change and decided to push a little further. "You know," he said casually, "if you're going to stick around, I could use an extra pair of hands. This place isn't going to clean itself, and some of these jobs take forever on my own." Lyra's smile faded. "Stick around," she repeated, unsure if he meant it. "Yeah," Ethan said, shrugging. "I mean, you don't have anywhere else to go, right? And it's not like I have a bunch of visitors knocking on my door. It's just me here most of the time. Could be nice to have some company." The idea of staying scared her, but it also gave her a strange sense of hope. She looked at Ethan, searching for any sign that he might change his mind, but his expression was sincere. I'll help," she said finally, "if that's okay." "More than okay," Ethan replied, handing her a tool. "Welcome to the team, Lyra." For the first time in a long while, Lyra felt like she belonged somewhere. As she took the tool and began helping Ethan, she realized that maybe, just maybe, she had found a place where she could start over. Days turned into weeks as Lyra adjusted to life in Ethan's workshop. At first, she wasn't sure how to fit in. The tools were unfamiliar, and human technology seemed crude compared to what she'd known growing up. But under Ethan's patient guidance, she began to learn. He showed her how to use a plasma cutter, repair broken circuits, and even how to jury-rig parts from salvaged scraps. "You've got a knack for this," Ethan said one afternoon, watching as Lyra carefully reassembled a damaged control panel. "You sure you haven't done this before?" Lyra smiled shyly. "Not like this," she admitted. "My family didn't let me do much with my hands. They said it wasn't proper." "Well, they missed out," Ethan replied with a grin. "You're better at this than half the mechanics I've met." His praise warmed her, but it also brought a pang of sadness. She thought about how different her life could have been if her family had valued her for who she was, instead of trying to mold her into someone she wasn't. She quickly pushed the thought aside, focusing instead on the comforting rhythm of work. As the days passed, Lyra began to open up more. She told Ethan about her homeworld, describing its towering crystal cities and vibrant skies. She spoke of her family's strict traditions and how she never seemed to fit in. Ethan listened without judgment, his green eyes full of understanding. "I get it," he said one evening, as they shared a simple meal of ration bars and rehydrated stew. "I never fit in back on Earth, either. That's why I left. Figured I'd have better luck out here." "Did you?" Lyra asked, curious. Ethan chuckled. "Depends on the day. Some days, yeah. Other days, not so much. But meeting you? That's one of the good days." Lyra felt her cheeks flush, a strange but not unpleasant sensation. She looked away, hiding her smile. Ethan had a way of making her feel seen, as if she mattered. The bond between them grew stronger with each passing day. They worked together, laughed together, and even faced small challenges together, like the time a faulty energy converter sparked and nearly set the workshop on fire. Lyra had acted quickly, grabbing a fire suppressant and extinguishing the flames before they could spread. "You saved my shop," Ethan said afterward, his voice full of gratitude. "Guess I owe you one." "You don't owe me anything," Lyra replied. "I'm just glad I could help." Despite their growing friendship, Lyra couldn't shake the feeling that her past would catch up to her. She often found herself glancing nervously at the door or tensing at the sound of approaching footsteps. Ethan noticed but didn't press her for answers. Instead, he tried to make her feel safe, reinforcing the workshop's security systems and reassuring her that no one could get in without his permission. One night, as they sat under the stars outside the workshop, Lyra finally asked the question that had been on her mind for days. "Why are you helping me, Ethan? You barely know me." Ethan leaned back, staring up at the sky. "I don't need a reason," he said after a moment. "Sometimes, you just see someone who needs a hand, and you offer it. Besides, I know what it's like to feel lost. No one should have to go through that alone." His words struck a chord in Lyra. For so long, she had felt alone, unwanted. But with Ethan, things were different. He didn't see her as a burden or an outcast. He saw her as a person, someone worth helping. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice barely audible over the gentle hum of the night. Ethan glanced at her and smiled. "Anytime, Lyra, anytime." For the first time in her life, Lyra felt like she wasn't just surviving, she was living. And it was all thanks to the human who had given her a chance. The peaceful rhythm of life in the workshop was shattered one morning when Lyra woke to the sound of raised voices outside. The familiar hum of the city was drowned out by the heavy footsteps of strangers. She peeked through a small window and felt her heart sink. 3 figures, tall and imposing, stood near the entrance, their metallic armor gleaming under the pale morning light. They were bounty hunters. Lyra recognized their kind immediately. Their rigid stances and cold, calculating eyes told her all she needed to know. Her family had sent them. She felt her breath quicken as fear gripped her. Ethan appeared behind her, his brow furrowed as he followed her gaze. "Friends of yours?" he asked quietly. Lyra shook her head. "They're here for me." Ethan's jaw tightened. "Stay here," he said firmly. "I'll handle this." Before she could protest, he stepped outside, the door swinging shut behind him. Lyra pressed herself against the wall, listening intently. "You're Ethan, the human mechanic," one of the bounty hunters said, their voice cold and mechanical. "We've tracked someone to this location. The fugitive. Hand her over, and we won't cause trouble." Ethan's voice was calm but firm. "I don't know what you're talking about. There's no fugitive here." "Don't lie to us," another hunter growled. "We know she's here. A young woman with pale blue skin. She doesn't belong here." Lyra's heart pounded in her chest. She felt an overwhelming urge to run, but she couldn't leave Ethan to face them alone. She clenched her fists, her mind racing for a solution. "You've got the wrong place," Ethan said, his tone unwavering. "Now, I suggest you leave before things get messy." There was a long pause. Then the first hunter spoke again, his voice dripping with menace. "You're making a mistake, human. Step aside, or we'll search the place ourselves." Inside, Lyra spotted a small device on the workbench, a jammer Ethan had been repairing earlier. An idea sparked in her mind. She grabbed the device and quickly tinkered with its settings, her hands trembling as she worked. If she could activate it, it might disrupt the hunters' communications and give them a chance to escape. Outside, the tension escalated. "This is your last warning," one of the hunters said, his hand moving toward a weapon. "I'm not letting you step foot in my workshop," Ethan replied, his voice steady. Lyra burst through the door, clutching the modified jammer. "Wait," she shouted, surprising both Ethan and the bounty hunters. The hunters turned toward her, their eyes narrowing. "There she is," one of them hissed, stepping forward. Before they could act, Lyra activated the jammer. A high-pitched whine filled the air, and the hunters staggered back, clutching their helmets as the device interfered with their systems. Sparks flew from their armor, and their weapons flickered uselessly. "Ethan, now!" Lyra shouted. Ethan didn't hesitate. He grabbed her arm and pulled her toward the back of the workshop. "This way," he urged, leading her to a hidden hatch beneath the floor. They scrambled inside, closing it just as the hunters began to recover. The hatch led to an underground passage, a route Ethan had built years ago as a precaution. They moved quickly through the dimly lit tunnel, their footsteps echoing off the metal walls. "Nice move with the jammer," Ethan said, glancing at her as they ran. Lyra managed a weak smile, her heart still racing. I couldn't let them hurt you." They emerged into a quiet alley on the outskirts of the city. Ethan looked around, ensuring the coast was clear. "We can't go back to the workshop," he said grimly. "They'll be watching it now." Lyra nodded, guilt and fear swirling in her chest. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "This is all my fault." Ethan placed a hand on her shoulder, his green eyes steady. "Don't be. We'll figure this out, together." For the first time, Lyra felt a glimmer of hope. Ethan didn't blame her, and he wasn't giving up. Maybe, just maybe, they could find a way to escape the shadows of her past. Together, they would face whatever came next. The air in the alley was cool and quiet, but Lyra's heart was still pounding from their close call. Ethan leaned against the wall, catching his breath, while Lyra scanned their surroundings nervously. The bounty hunters would regroup soon, and it was only a matter of time before they found the underground passage. "We can't stay here," Ethan said, breaking the silence. "They'll sweep the whole area looking for you." Lyra nodded, her fear mingling with guilt. "I didn't mean for this to happen," she whispered. "If you hadn't helped me, they wouldn't have come." Ethan shook his head. "You didn't choose this, Lyra. They did, and I'm not going to let them take you." His words brought a strange comfort to Lyra, but she knew they couldn't rely on hope alone. "Do you have a plan?" she asked, her voice steadier now. Ethan rubbed the back of his neck, thinking. "There's an old cargo ship at the scrapyard a few clicks from here. I've been working on it for months, trying to get it spaceworthy. It's not perfect, but it might be our best shot." "A ship?" Lyra's eyes widened. "Can it even fly?" Ethan gave a wry smile. "If I can fix broken-down junk from half the galaxy, I can fix that ship. The question is, can we get to it before those hunters catch us?" Lyra's mind raced. The thought of leaving the planet both terrified and thrilled her. It would mean abandoning the little she had left behind, but it would also mean freedom. Freedom from her family, her past, and the hunters chasing her. "What do we need to do?" she asked. Ethan pulled a small map from his jacket pocket, spreading it out on the ground. "The scrapyard is here," he said, pointing to a marked spot. "It's about an hour's walk, but we'll have to move carefully. If the hunters pick up our trail, we're done." Lyra studied the map, her mind already forming a plan. We can use the market streets to blend in, she suggested. The crowd will slow them down. And if we take the maintenance tunnels near the industrial district, it might buy us extra time. Ethan nodded, impressed. Smart. You've been paying attention. I've had to, Lyra said with a small smile. Surviving in a city like this isn't easy. They set off quickly, sticking to the shadows as they moved through the narrow alleys. The sounds of the city buzzed around them, vendors shouting, engines humming, and the occasional laughter of children. Lyra pulled her hood up, keeping her pale features hidden. Ethan stayed close, his sharp eyes scanning for any sign of trouble. As they reached the market streets, Lyra's nerves tightened. The crowd was thick, a chaotic blend of species from across the galaxy. She clutched Ethan's arm, afraid of losing him in the sea of people. Stay close, he whispered, guiding her through the throng. They weaved between stalls, the scent of spices and metallic wares filling the air. For a moment, it almost felt normal, as if they were just two travelers exploring the market. But the tension in the back of her mind wouldn't fade. Suddenly, Ethan stopped, his grip on her arm tightening. Lyra followed his gaze and froze. At the edge of the market, one of the bounty hunters stood, scanning the crowd with a sharp, predatory gaze. They're here, Ethan muttered, pulling Lyra into the shadow of a nearby stall. We need to move. Now. Lyra's heart raced as they slipped into a side alley, leaving the market behind. The noise faded, replaced by the eerie silence of the industrial district. They ducked into an abandoned maintenance tunnel, its dim lights flickering overhead. Almost there, Ethan said, his voice low but determined. The scrapyard is just ahead. Lyra nodded, her resolve hardening. She didn't know what awaited them in the skies, but for the first time in her life, she felt ready to fight for her freedom. With Ethan by her side, she had a chance. All they had to do now was reach the ship and hope it could fly. Lyra and Ethan emerged from the maintenance tunnel into the outskirts of the city. The air was cooler here, carrying the faint metallic tang of the scrapyard ahead. The towering piles of rusted parts and discarded ship fragments loomed in the distance, an eerie silhouette against the fading light of the twin suns. Almost there, Ethan said, his voice low but encouraging. He kept a steady pace, his eyes scanning their surroundings for any sign of the bounty hunters. Lyra stayed close, her steps light and silent. Every crunch of gravel beneath her boots made her wince, as though it might give them away. As they approached the scrapyard gates, Lyra couldn't help but glance over her shoulder. Her heart sank when she saw movement far behind them. Figures in the distance, closing in fast. They're coming, she whispered urgently. Ethan turned and followed her gaze, his jaw tightening. They're faster than I thought, he muttered. We need to move. Once we're inside, we'll have some cover. The gates creaked loudly as Ethan pushed them open, the sound echoing across the scrapyard. They slipped inside, weaving through the maze of twisted metal and discarded machinery. The air was thick with the smell of oil and rust, and the shadows of the towering scrap piles stretched long in the dimming light. There, Ethan pointed ahead to a battered ship sitting in the middle of the yard. It was larger than Lyra expected, with patches of its hull mismatched and welded together. Despite its rough appearance, there was something oddly hopeful about it. "This is your ship?" Lyra asked, a mix of doubt and hope in her voice. Ethan smirked. "She's not much to look at, but she'll fly. Hopefully." "Hopefully," Lyra echoed, her nerves spiking. "Relax," Ethan said with a grin. "Trust me." They hurried toward the ship, and Ethan quickly climbed a small ladder to open the hatch. The inside was just as rough as the exterior, with exposed wires and makeshift panels, but it felt sturdy. Ethan moved to the cockpit, flipping switches and pressing buttons. The ship hummed faintly, the systems coming to life. "Start securing the hatch," Ethan called out. "I'll get the engines warmed up." Lyra nodded, her hands trembling as she fumbled with the controls. She had just locked the hatch when a loud bang echoed from outside. She froze, her breath catching in her throat. The bounty hunters had arrived. "Ethan," she shouted. "They're here." Ethan cursed under his breath, his hands flying over the controls. "I need a few more minutes. Keep them off the ship." Lyra's mind raced. She spotted a small console near the hatch and realized it controlled an external defense turret. Her fingers flew over the controls, activating the turret and aiming it at the figures approaching through the scrapyard. The turret fired, sending a burst of energy toward the hunters. They dove for cover, temporarily halted. "Nice shot," Ethan called from the cockpit. "Keep them busy." Lyra's fear was replaced by adrenaline as she fired again, forcing the hunters to retreat further. But she knew it wouldn't hold them off forever. "How much longer?" she yelled. "Almost there," Ethan replied. The engines roared to life, and the ship vibrated beneath her feet. "Get to the cockpit." Lyra scrambled to the front of the ship, her heart pounding. Ethan motioned for her to strap in, and she did so quickly. Outside, the hunters were regrouping, their weapons aimed at the ship. "Hold on," Ethan shouted. The ship lurched upward, its engines straining but functional. Shots from the hunters' weapons bounced off the hull, but the ship rose higher, escaping their reach. Lyra gripped the seat, her eyes wide as the scrapyard shrank beneath them. Ethan let out a triumphant laugh. "We're in the air." Lyra's chest heaved with relief, but her mind was already racing with questions. "Where are we going?" "Somewhere they can't find us," Ethan said, his tone serious now. "We'll figure it out together." As the stars began to fill the cockpit window, Lyra looked at Ethan, her fear fading into determination. For the first time in her life, she felt truly free, and she wasn't going to let anything take that away. The ship soared through the dark expanse of space, its engines humming steadily. Lyra sat in the co-pilot's seat, her hands still gripping the armrests tightly. The adrenaline of their escape lingered, leaving her both exhilarated and exhausted. She glanced at Ethan, who was focused on the controls, his expression a mixture of relief and concentration. "Didn't think she'd actually fly," Ethan admitted with a small grin, breaking the silence. "But she's holding together." Lyra managed a weak smile. "You had me worried back there." "Worried?" Ethan chuckled. "You were the one blasting those hunters like you'd done it 100 times before." She laughed softly, surprising herself. "I guess I didn't have much of a choice." Ethan glanced at her, his green eyes warm. "You did good, Lyra. I couldn't have pulled this off without you." Her chest swelled with pride, but the moment was short-lived. Her thoughts turned to the bounty hunters and the family that had sent them. "They'll keep coming," she said, her voice quieter now. "They won't stop until they find me." Ethan's grin faded, replaced by a serious expression. "We'll deal with that when it happens. For now, we need a place to lay low." He adjusted the ship's navigation, pulling up a map of nearby systems. "There's a small, uncharted moon a few light years from here. No settlements, no scanners. It's perfect for hiding out while we figure out our next move." Lyra nodded. "How long will it take to get there?" "A few hours," Ethan replied. "You should rest. You've been through a lot." She hesitated, her body craving sleep but her mind too restless. "What about you?" Ethan smiled faintly. "I'll keep us on course. Don't worry. You're safe here." Safe. The word felt foreign to Lyra, but as she leaned back in the chair, the steady hum of the ship lulled her into a sense of calm. For the first time in what felt like forever, she allowed herself to close her eyes. When Lyra woke, the cockpit was bathed in the soft glow of distant starlight. She stretched and glanced at Ethan, who was still at the controls. His eyes were tired, but he looked determined. "Did you sleep at all?" she asked, her voice groggy. "Not much," Ethan admitted, "but we're almost there." Lyra stood and moved to the viewport, her breath catching as she saw the moon Ethan had mentioned. It was a small, rocky sphere with faint traces of an atmosphere. It didn't look like much, but it was quiet, hidden, a place they could breathe. The ship descended smoothly, landing on a flat stretch of terrain surrounded by jagged cliffs. As the engines powered down, the silence of the moon enveloped them. Ethan leaned back in his seat, exhaling deeply. "Welcome to our new home. For now, at least." Lyra followed him as he opened the hatch, the cool air of the moon brushing against her face. The landscape was barren but oddly beautiful, with its gray rocks shimmering faintly under the light of nearby stars. She stepped onto the surface, feeling the solid ground beneath her feet. "It's peaceful," she said, her voice almost a whisper. Ethan nodded, standing beside her. "Not bad for a hideout." They spent the next few hours setting up a temporary camp. Ethan rigged up a small generator to power the ship's systems, while Lyra helped organize their limited supplies. Despite the barren surroundings, the moon felt like a haven, a place where they could regroup and plan their next steps. As they sat outside the ship, sharing a quiet meal, Lyra looked at Ethan. "Why are you doing all this for me?" she asked, her voice filled with genuine curiosity. "You don't even know me." Ethan met her gaze, his expression thoughtful. "Maybe I see a bit of myself in you," he said. "Someone trying to escape a past they didn't choose. And maybe I just don't like seeing good people left behind." Lyra felt a lump rise in her throat. For so long, she had been defined by what others thought of her, by her family's rejection. But with Ethan, she felt something different. Acceptance. Understanding. "Thank you," she said softly. Ethan smiled, his tired face lighting up. "You don't have to thank me. We're in this together now." As the stars above twinkled in the endless sky, Lyra allowed herself a moment of peace. She didn't know what the future held, but for now she wasn't alone. And that made all the difference. The moon's stillness was both comforting and unsettling. Lyra and Ethan worked side by side for the next few days, improving their small refuge. Ethan focused on repairing the ship's weaker systems while Lyra helped wherever she could, her sharp mind and steady hands proving invaluable. "You've got a real talent for this," Ethan said one evening as Lyra rewired a damaged control panel inside the ship. "I should have hired you years ago." Lyra chuckled softly, though her expression turned thoughtful. "It feels good to be useful," she admitted. "For so long, I was told I wasn't good enough. But here, I feel like I belong." Ethan paused, leaning against the wall and studying her. "You do belong, Lyra. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." Her cheeks warmed at his words, and she smiled, feeling a sense of gratitude she couldn't quite put into words. But the moment of peace didn't last long. A sudden beeping from the ship's console caught their attention. Ethan moved quickly, checking the monitor. His expression darkened. "We've got company," he said grimly. Lyra's heart sank. "The bounty hunters." Ethan nodded, his jaw tightening. "Their ship just entered orbit. They must have tracked us somehow. Maybe a signal from the workshop, or a tracer we didn't catch." Panic surged through Lyra. "What do we do? We can't fight them off." Ethan's mind was already racing. "No, but we can outsmart them. They're expecting us to run or hide, but we'll do neither." Lyra frowned, confused. "What do you mean?" Ethan turned to her, a spark of determination in his eyes. "We lure them in and disable their ship. If they can't chase us, we'll have the upper hand." Lyra hesitated, doubt clouding her thoughts. "That's risky. What if it doesn't work?" Ethan placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "It'll work. You trust me, right?" She looked into his eyes and saw the confidence there. Slowly, she nodded. "I trust you." The plan was simple but dangerous. Using the ship's communication system, Ethan sent out a decoy signal that mimicked an emergency distress beacon. The bounty hunters, eager to capture Lyra, would follow the signal and land nearby. Meanwhile, Lyra and Ethan would use the moon's rugged terrain to set up an ambush. As they prepared, Lyra's nerves frayed. She helped Ethan rig an EMP device from spare parts, her hands trembling as she worked. "What if something goes wrong?" she asked quietly. Ethan paused, looking at her. Then we adapt, he said firmly. We've made it this far, haven't we? His calmness steadied her, and she took a deep breath, nodding. Together, they finished the EMP and positioned it near the landing site. Then, they climbed to a rocky outcrop overlooking the area, waiting for their pursuers. The bounty hunters arrived just as Ethan predicted. Their sleek ship descended, landing with a hiss of pressurized air. 3 figures emerged, their armor gleaming under the moonlight. They're splitting up, Ethan whispered, watching through a pair of binoculars. They're looking for us. Lyra's heart pounded as the hunters moved closer to their trap. Ethan handed her a small remote. When they're in range, press this. It'll fry their ship systems and give us a chance to escape. Lyra nodded, clutching the remote tightly. She watched as the hunters approached the EMP device, oblivious to the danger. When the moment was right, she pressed the button. The EMP device emitted a low hum, followed by a burst of energy that rippled through the air. The hunter's ship went dark, its lights flickering out as smoke rose from its hull. The hunters turned in alarm, shouting to each other, but it was too late. Ethan grabbed Lyra's hand. "Run," he shouted. They scrambled down the rocky slope, heading back to their own ship. The bounty hunters, disoriented but furious, began to chase them, but the rocky terrain slowed them down. Lyra's lungs burned as they ran, but she refused to stop. They reached their ship just as the hunters were closing in. Ethan pushed Lyra inside and leaped into the cockpit, firing up the engines. "Hold on," he yelled. The ship roared to life, lifting off the ground and leaving the hunters behind. Lyra watched through the viewport as the moon grew smaller, the hunters' disabled ship shrinking into the distance. Her chest heaved as relief washed over her. "We did it," she said, almost in disbelief. Ethan grinned, his eyes shining with victory. "We did, but it's not over yet. We need to keep moving." As they entered the safety of the stars, Lyra looked at Ethan, a sense of hope flickering in her heart. Together, they had faced impossible odds and won. Whatever came next, she knew they could handle it. Together, the ship cruised through the vast emptiness of space, the stars stretching out endlessly around them. Lyra sat in the co-pilot's seat, her hands resting on her lap, still trembling slightly from the adrenaline of their escape. Ethan leaned back in his chair, a satisfied grin on his face as he checked the ship's systems. "They won't be following us anytime soon," he said, breaking the silence. "That EMP fried their systems good. It'll take them days to fix it, maybe longer." Lyra exhaled deeply, her tension slowly melting away. "I can't believe we made it," she said softly, her voice filled with both relief and disbelief. "If it weren't for you." Ethan glanced at her, his grin softening into a warm smile. "Hey, you were the one who set off the EMP. You didn't freeze. You didn't panic. You've got more courage than you give yourself credit for." His words made her cheeks flush, and she looked away, a small smile tugging at her lips. "I just didn't want to let you down." "You didn't," Ethan said firmly. "Not even close." For a moment, they sat in comfortable silence, the hum of the ship's engines filling the space between them. Lyra stared out at the stars, her thoughts drifting. She had spent so long running from her family, from her past, from herself. But for the first time, she felt like she was moving towards something instead of away. "What happens now?" she asked, turning to Ethan. He shrugged, his grin returning. "That's the beauty of it, isn't it? We've got a whole galaxy out there. We can go anywhere, do anything. The only question is, what do you want to do?" Lyra hesitated. No one had ever asked her that before. Her life had always been dictated by others, by her family, by their expectations, by the fear of what might happen if she stepped out of line. But now, the choice was hers. I want to make a life for myself," she said slowly, the words feeling strange but right. "Something real, something I can be proud of." Ethan nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Sounds like a good plan. And wherever you go, I've got your back." Her chest tightened at his words, a mixture of gratitude and something deeper. "Thank you, Ethan, for everything." "Don't mention it," he said, his grin widening. "You're stuck with me now anyway. We make a pretty good team." Lyra laughed softly, the sound light and genuine. It felt good to laugh, to feel something other than fear or doubt. She looked at Ethan, the human who had risked everything for her, and felt a warmth she hadn't known in a long time. As they drifted through space, Ethan brought up the navigation screen. "There's a neutral zone not far from here," he said. "Lots of travelers, lots of work. We could start there. What do you think?" Lyra nodded. "It sounds perfect." Ethan set the course, the ship adjusting its trajectory with a quiet hum. The stars outside shifted, their light dancing across the cockpit. Lyra leaned back in her seat, her gaze fixed on the endless expanse ahead. For the first time, the unknown didn't scare her, it excited her. The galaxy was vast and unpredictable, but with Ethan by her side, she felt ready to face whatever it had in store. As the ship glided toward its new destination, Lyra allowed herself to dream. She thought of the life she could build, the person she could become. She wasn't running anymore. She was free. And freedom, she realized, was the greatest gift of all.